Okay, friends, welcome to this first trade show or session. We have 25 minutes together, to discuss the very important topic of church planting multiplication. When we think in terms of church planting in Europe, there are two great needs that we need to address. The one is conversion-based church planting. The way we plant churches in Europe or even in North America is we organize believers who collaborate together to begin to evangelize, disciple making, and then plant these churches. So it's organized church planting. When I look at the New Testament, I see conversion-based church planting. Lydia comes to Christ, her entire oikos, and that becomes the foundation for this new church. So conversion-based church planting, and then getting to a movement of church planting. When David Garrison, and I'm sure that all of us have read his work, Church Planting Movements, his seminal book on church planting movements, when he illustrates movements around the world, when he comes to describe Europe, I believe he hiccups because he uses two illustrations to illustrate church planting multiplication in Europe: the gypsies who are coming to Christ and the Alpha Course movement, neither of which have to do with church planting. The Alpha Course is a way to grow your church, and the gypsies are very self-contained in terms of their cultural identity. They're not reaching out, they're not planting churches outside of their own cultural venues. So what we need to see and trust God is a church planting multiplication movement. What would that look like? I'd like to share with you, and these ideas come from my book, The Jesus Model, Planting Churches the Jesus Way. You can read more about that. It's the only book I've ever read that talks about Jesus as a church planter. Usually you start with the Acts of the Apostles and start from there. This is a situation in which we find ourselves in. These are denominational entities, silos we would call them. So people living self-contained in their silos, in their denominations, in their networks, not talking with one another, but being very internal. And what we need to do in order to have a church planting movement is to break out of the silos and do what we're doing in these days, come together and to say the kingdom of God is much greater than our little part of the kingdom, our denomination, and we need to collaborate. So 7 characteristics of movement in order to define or to picture what a church planting multiplication movement might look like in Europe. The first characteristic is that it is, timed release. Timed release. Sometimes when we get a cold, we take medicine, we take a pill, and that pill is actually filled with many tiny time capsules. They're medicine, little balls of medicine that release themselves incrementally in our system, our blood system. Some of them are released immediately when they enter into our body. Others are released within 2 hours, 4 hours, and so on. We need a system of timed release church planting. That is, as we start a new church, we need to know when we will start the next church. It's not so much important to think about when you're starting your new church, but when are you going to start the next church off of that new church? I believe in Europe today, in my federation, the German Evangelical Free Church, our release point is about every 7 years. I believe we can get that down to 3 years. Every 3 years, every healthy church can plant a new church, and every planted church plants a new church every 3 years. If you do that, you need to know what you're going to be doing in the 3 years while you're planting your church. In the first year, what you do is you ask God to surface the new church planter from within your church plant. In the second year, you train him to do everything that you do in ministry. In the third year, you give him a ministry leadership assignment in your church plant. And at the last part of that third year, you give him a fishing license. He has the right to take as many as 10 people from your church plant. He can have anybody except for my wife. And he can take these away, and they plant a new daughter church, okay? The second characteristic is generational distance. Good church planting churches are churches, mother churches that keep bearing daughter churches. But what happens oftentimes is that they never get beyond themselves. They are always the first cause in planting churches. My wife's grandparents were married for over 70 years. When they died, they left a progeny of 150 people. A grandfather was 105 when he died. Grandmother was 97. And we have a picture of them holding a fifth generation baby in their arms. My question is, did they generate that baby? No, they didn't. They were old. There were Abraham and Sarah. They weren't biologically able to do that. But indirectly they did. So the power of a church planting movement is to think in terms of generational distance. If you get 5 generations removed from the first cause, you will get to a movement. The part of the power of church planting movements is the power of indirect influence, not direct influence. If you're constantly being the first cause of planting your churches, you'll never get to a movement. You'll be self-contained in your own power pack as a church planting church. What you need to do is get away from yourself. So we need to stop counting the numbers of daughter churches we planted and begin to count the numbers of generations we have spawned. In Germany, I think we're seeing a third generation church planting movement, but it's not a movement yet because it's still too much tied to the first cause. We need to get to the 5th generation, which would mean that the first cause is irrelevant to the movement. Things are happening almost automatically in the system itself. We need to have an external focus. That's the third characteristic. And when Jesus went with his disciples in Matthew 9:35 to 38, he said to them, look into the harvest. We are going into the harvest. Our band will be externally focused. What he was actually saying to his disciples is that the future of our movement lies in the harvest field and not in the barn. Sick and dying churches will emphasize 3 things in Germany. I'll say in evangelical free churches in Germany, they emphasize 3 things: the members, the youth, and the building. The members, the youth, and the building. All those 3 things, the members that you have, the youth that you have, the building in which you meet, are things that you have. And what you have to keep up. But they are not the future of the church. The future of every church lies in those people who are not yet followers of Jesus. So if we become internally focused, and the older a church gets, the more inward focused it gets. So we need to constantly break out of an inward focus and have an external focus. Then we have discipleship depth. I believe in evangelicalism today, we have an overemphasis on leadership. We emphasize leadership to the detriment of disciple making. If we turn that around, if we emphasize disciple making, we will always have good leaders. If we do not emphasize disciple making and overemphasize leadership, what we will have is skilled leaders without godly character. That is the problem in the church today. People who can lead, who can inspire, who can teach, but their lives do not mesh with what they're saying. So we need to emphasize discipleship, and out of proven disciple makers, we generate our leadership base. We need to have an intentional mindset if we want to get to a leader, to a multiplication movement. Intentionality means we focus on being part of a movement beyond our local church plant. A concert pianist that you would pay a lot of money to go to see play has become a concert pianist because she has wanted to become a concert pianist from the time she was a small girl, perhaps. You do not drift into becoming a concert pianist. You will never drift into getting into a movement. Let me say this, movements are never organic. They're always induced movements. Birthing a church planting movement is never an organic thing. It is always something that is intentional, that is released by the vision of the leadership. And did you know that vision itself dies every month? Vision will die every month. If you look at the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah instilled a vision for rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And after 26 days, those who were rebuilding the walls had stopped doing their work. Why did they stop doing it? Because they lost a vision for why they were doing what they were doing. So vision will die every 30 days. That means if you are a leader of a church plant or a church planting movement, you need to know that what you have said last month has dissipated. It is no longer there. You need to refresh it. You need to say it in a new way. You need to say it in a new context. But you need to refresh that vision every month because people lose sight of why they are doing what they're doing. People need to be taught not just to know how they are to do things, but to know why they are doing the things that they're doing. And that pertains to church planting as well. The sixth character quality is reproducible models. I've drawn here, I'm not a great drawer, but Keith inspired me to make my own drawing. This is a tennis net. And the wonderful thing about the game of tennis or ping pong is that it is a game that is held in tension. The net is held in tension by two posts. In ministry, we have two posts, but in most ministry contexts, they only use one post. It is the post of leadership or giftedness. There needs to be another post holding the entire ministry in tension, and this other post is reproducible systems that are better than the people that use them. I need to explain that, okay? Only 10% of our members will have the gift of evangelist, only 10%. But 100% of our people have the commission to go and make disciples. And discipleship always starts before people are converted. Did you know that? Jesus said, go and make disciples of all the heathen, the nations, the ta ethne. Those are people who do not yet believe in Jesus. So disciple making always begins before conversion, and then you lead them to the point of surrendering their lives to Jesus as Savior and Lord. But how do you help the 90% of your people who do not have the gift of evangelism? Well, you give them a reproducible system that they can use that will do that with them. I'll give you an example. You probably all know Neil Cole's work, Organic Church, Organic Leadership, and that LTGs, right, Life Transformational Groups. I have worked with his concept and have refined it. To see spiritual change, you need three things to come together. You need to have openness, nearness, relational nearness, and accountability. Accountability answers the question, how did we actually live last week? Where have we been tempted sexually last week, and what did we do about it? Did we waste money last week, or did we steward our money in a wise fashion? Were we angry with somebody last week, and did we remain angry? Did we give our families priority time? These are real life questions that need to be posed often in our churches, but we don't do it that way. What we do is we preach and teach in the conjunctive mode. We say you should, you ought to live this way, and we all nod, but we don't do it. It is only when we begin to ask, how have we actually lived last week, when depth comes into our lives and change comes into our lives. So this is the thing that I've been working with for years. I invite, and you have to separate the genders, women with women, men with men, because you will never have the openness that you need if you mix the genders. A man is not going to confess that he was looking at pornography on the internet for 2 hours last week if there's a woman present in the small group. So you have to keep the women among the women and the men among the men in terms of openness and honesty. You invite 2 men to your home, 2 Christians, and they need to be fat Christians, faithful, available, teachable. These are the 3 seminal qualities of people in which you invest. If you have a person who is faithful, he's available, he has time, but he's not teachable, he doesn't let himself be corrected, you do not touch them. You go to the fat people in your church. Make a separate list of your members and make a fat list. Who are all the fat people in my church in terms of my assessment? You invite 2 fat men to your home. You say, I want to do spiritual breathing with you. Spiritual breathing. Breathing in, exhaling. Inhaling, exhaling. They say, well, what is that? You say, inhaling means we'll read a chapter in the Bible every day. Each one of us will read the same chapter, but we'll do it at home. And then one day a week we'll get together and we'll share how has God been speaking to us through the scriptures. That's inhaling. And then we will exhale. I'll give you the questions. I've just mentioned some of the questions that we use. And we will ask ourselves these questions and we will answer them honestly every week. And they agree to this. They say, okay, we'll do this with you. At that point, you give them each a yogurt, a little portion of yogurt. And you say, start eating this yogurt. Tell me the parallels between the yogurt and our mini group. I call it a mini group. And they'll say, oh, it's nutritious. Yeah, this sounds like it's nutritious. It's small. How come you gave us a small portion? Why didn't you give us a big portion? So we're a small group. It's fruity. This sounds like it's going to be fruity. Everything that they say is correct. There are parallels. But then you say, you've missed one important thing. Look at the top of the packaging of the yogurt. There's a date stamped on it. It's the expiration date. There will come a time when this yogurt could even be hazardous to your health. The same thing with a small group or a mini group. That's why small groups are oftentimes boring, because they have outlived their expiration date. So the smaller the group, the faster you have to reproduce. So what happens is we say we'll give ourselves an expiration date, and it will be 6 months. We'll do this every week for 6 months, and then we'll do something else. But then after you've done it for a month, you invite a 4th person into your mini group, man or woman, and that 4th person will be a non-Christian. And you will invite the non-Christian to do exactly what you've been doing, but invite him only for 2 weeks to allay his fears. So he enters into this kind of community, this depth, for 2 weeks, and in 80% of the cases that I've been involved in, he wants to stay. And 80% of those people become followers of Jesus in the same reproducible system. So it evangelizes and disciples with people who don't have the gift of evangelism and is reproducible. So after 6 months, you eat well, and you divide up into 2 groups of 2, and you add, each one of your duos adds a 3rd person, and the process starts all over again. Church planting is really easy. If you can do a mini group, if you can multiply a mini group 3 or 4 times, you've probably found your church planter. You do it on the smallest subset in the church's life, and then extrapolate on the mega level. And then the last characteristic is a multiplication coordinator. That is somebody who is outside of the local ministry, who has a meta view of the entire process, who keeps track. He's like a controller in business. He or she keeps track of the progress of these church plants, knows when the church is going to release another church, knows the disciple-making process, and keeps their leaders on track. Church planting, as you know, is so all-consuming that all you can do is invest in this one project. What you need is somebody outside of that local ministry who oversees all of these church plants to keep you on track. You know, when Disney World was first opened in the early 70s, there were thousands of people who were there for the first time when their doors opened, but Walt Disney had already died when Disney World opened. And a young reporter went up to Mrs. Disney and he said to her, "Oh, Mrs. Disney, wouldn't it be great if Walt were here to see this day?" And she said to him, "Young man, if Walt hadn't seen this, you wouldn't be here." So, church planting multiplication is all about seeing something that we have not yet experienced, trusting God to see it happen. So, here are some questions. What is the one issue I want to focus on that would lead to collaboration toward multiplication? Of these 7 characteristics, what is the one characteristic that you want to most focus on in order to see collaboration? Who are the leaders I want to begin to build into for them to want them to help others to do a church plant or a movement? And what do I need to change in my own life in order for others to be influenced toward a movement? Sometimes it's not doing new things, it's stopping doing old things. So, that in a nutshell, you can read more in my book, The Jesus Model. And this is the pyramid, I would say. It starts with intentionality, has an external focus, a multiplication coordinator is in place, discipleship depth, reproducing models, systems, timed release, and generational distance. That's the G7 pyramid. You may have questions. I maybe have answers, but if you have some questions, shoot. And if I don't have an answer, Craig will.
I missed the T on the fact.
What's that? Fat. Oh, teachable. Teachable.
Teachable.
Yes, teachable. Faithful, available, teachable. Yes.
What were some things in your context that helped the denominations to stop just thinking about their silos? What were a couple things that happened that started that process where people started to cooperate or talk with others?
What are some things that
Contributed toward that?
contributed to breaking out of the silos? I think well, in Germany, it's going to happen. It has yet to have happened, but we'll hear about France. And reconciliation, where leaders have sinned against other leaders and they've been reconciled. And then the need of the harvest, the greatness of the harvest. You never look at the numbers of churches you have. You always look at the greatness of the harvest. You let yourself be driven by the harvest. As Jesus saw the people who were like sheep without a shepherd, he was moved with compassion. Only when we see the harvest the way Jesus sees the harvest will we begin to move toward one another and say, no denomination in and of itself will be able to do this. We have to come together. So necessity, yeah.